This episode of Let's Dig Deeper podcast is supported by the University of Copenhagen School of Archaeology. Welcome, dear listener, to Let's Dig Deeper, the podcast where we talk all about archaeology, history, art, and culture. My name is Zinat Haroun. I'm a student of classical archaeology here at the University of Copenhagen, and in this podcast, I'm going to take you along for interviews with some of the amazing people working in the field. We'll talk with archaeologists, historians, professionals, and beyond. Hopefully, we'll learn more about the past in the process. And today, I'm joined by two incredible guests, Tobias Richter and Joe Rowe. Welcome to the studio, both of you.
Thank you. Thanks.
And Tobias, you are Associate Professor at the Department of Cross-Cultural and Regional Studies, or TORS, here at the University of Copenhagen. You got your PhD in Archaeology from University College London after having been at the University of Wales. Your work focuses on Near Eastern archaeology, and you're involved in several research projects in both Jordan and Iran. And among other things, your research interest lies in the prehistory of Southwest Asia and the emergence of agriculture there. And Joe, you are Assistant Professor, also at TORS here at UCPH. You have a PhD in prehistoric archaeology from the University of Bern, and before that, you've been at both University College London and at Durham. Your research also focuses on early farming communities in West Asia and in Europe, and you combine data science and machine learning with archaeological evidence. You're currently part of the project Ancient Environmental Genomics Initiative for Sustainability, or AGIS, and beyond that, you lead field service in the desert of Jordan. And today, we're going to talk about the history and archaeology of early farming communities in the ancient Near East. And before we get into it, let's just situate ourselves geographically and chronologically. So if we could travel back to the early beginning of what we would call agriculture, where and when do we find ourselves?
Well, we would find ourselves in Southwest Asia or West Asia, or as we say, generally speaking, the Middle East, the modern Middle East. So that's the region on the east side of the Mediterranean between roughly what's Turkey, Palestine, Israel, Jordan, all the way over to Iraq and Iran. And in especially the area that we call the Fertile Crescent, which is this arc of an area that runs from roughly the Sinai all the way up the Mediterranean coast through Turkey and the Taurus Mountains into the Zagros Mountains. And that's an area where there is very high rainfall, whereas the rest of the region is, more dry and more arid. And this area overlaps with the natural habitats of where some of the wild species that later became our crops, or some of our most significant crops like wheat and barley, and also the wild ancestors of our major domestic animals like sheep and goat, where they existed at that time. And over the course of about 7,000 or so years, from roughly, one can say, 15,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age, until about 8,000 years ago is when this entire process of the transition from what we call hunting and gathering to agriculture took place across that region.
All right. Thank you for that. Now that we know when and where we are, let's dig deeper. All right, now I want to ask the big question first to really set the tone of this episode, which is why should we care about the origins of farming? I mean, why is the shift from hunting and gathering to agriculture still one of the most important topics in archaeology today?
Well, it's generated so much debate, I think, for a number of reasons. One of them is that it really goes to the heart of the question of why do cultures change, right? So we have these hunters and gatherers from the Paleolithic that seem to be generally quite content. I mean, they're quite healthy. There is not such a high population density and so forth. And agriculture has always been seen as something that's quite laborious. You have to work in the field and it's hard work. It's also a little bit more risky being a farmer, especially at that early stage. So why change, right? And it's sort of a flashpoint of archaeological debate over why do cultures actually change? Is it something that comes from the outside of a society like climate change or demographic pressure? Or is it something that comes from the inside where there's social competition or different kind of ideologies that seem to be emerging? And of course, this transition in the Middle East towards agriculture has always been seen as this foundation of civilization, right? Without agriculture, has always been the argument that we wouldn't have had urbanism, we wouldn't have had writing, we wouldn't have had state societies, complex societies, and so forth. So it's always been seen as this very, very important foundational event that took place.
Yeah. And if we then imagine ourselves in that time, would agriculture seem like this inevitable development, or was it actually a highly unlikely experiment that just sort of happened to succeed? I mean, was agriculture inevitable?
Yeah, so I think if you look at the human scale, then it was a bit of chance. So the individual people that were first experimenting with farming in the Middle East, they probably had lots of stops and starts. We think that, maybe it took a period of 3,000 to 5,000 years for it to really go from the first experiments to when it really got going. So obviously within that very long time period, there's a lot of room for things to go wrong, people to go back to hunting, gathering, and then try again. But on the other hand, if you kind of zoom out and look globally, then agriculture didn't just begin in the Middle East. So agriculture has independently arose at least 6 or 7 times, maybe more, depending on how you count it, around the globe. And it did so always in the most recent climate epoch, which we call the Holocene. So from about 12,000 years ago to the present day. Everywhere it did arise, it then spread to the point that now 99.9% of the world's population are depending on agriculture to live. So in that global sense, we can definitely say we don't know exactly why, but there was something about the conditions of the Holocene, the climate era we're living now, that made agriculture mandatory or inevitable in some way.
And going off of that, many of us typically learn that agriculture began in this single core area of the Fertile Crescent and then it spread outwards from there. But how much of that story still actually holds up today?
Yeah, I mean, as Joe just said, it is a worldwide process that set in these different hearths of domestication, slightly different times. Western Asia is still considered to be the region where this process happened at the earliest point in time, just, closely followed now by the Yellow River Basin in China. But even in Southwest Asia, in the Fertile Crescent, it looks like this was a much more multi-regional process. So even within the region, we had this debate between, was it just one area in the southern Levant or in southeastern Anatolia where this started? But it now looks increasingly like the evidence suggests that there are these hunter-gatherer communities living in different parts of the region with different resources available to them, different ecological conditions that existed, slightly different types of social organization, and they take advantage of slightly different kind of plants and animals that exist in these environments. And somehow these things then start to mix and confluence over and into each other until what has sometimes been called this agricultural package of domesticated crops and domestic animals, and sedentism starts to emerge. And people take that and move that elsewhere into Europe and into Central Asia and into North Africa and so forth.
Yeah, so it's a copy of the same model, basically.
It's a copy of the same model, but even very early on, as people have just basically started to have this model or this package, they even begin to do things differently. So in the Levant, for example, in the semi-arid and arid areas where Joe and I do field work, towards the end of the pre-pottery Neolithic and the transition to the pottery Neolithic, so around about 8,000 or so, give or take, years ago, there emerges this nomadic pastoralism. So here we get, now groups of people that rely mostly on domestic sheep and goat, and they take that out into the desert and only occasionally plant a few crops, and they're not really sedentary like some of their brethren in the Levant or further in Anatolia.
They're more like shepherds in a way.
Exactly.
Yeah. But then how would a day in the life of one of these early farmers look like? I mean, what did they do? What did they spend their hours with?
Yeah, so this is the question that keeps me up at night, I think, actually. This is a great question because even though I've been studying early farming for over a decade, I really don't know the answer. And if I ask colleagues that have been studying it for a lifetime, I don't think they have a good answer either. And I find that fascinating. And I think it tells us something about the nature of archaeological evidence, that we have to base our knowledge on things. So we know what kind of tools people were using. We know what physical plants they used and how those changed through time. We know what kind of buildings they lived in. But to put that together into, okay, what was the actual farming practice at that time? That is very difficult. And there are some very basic questions that we just don't know the answer to. The major question is there's a spectrum between sort of gardening, where people would have tended small plots intensively using kind of similar techniques to what we do today. That's on one side of the spectrum. On the other hand, you can imagine sort of mini farming, where people have larger fields of cereals, maybe, and they're sort of working them on a larger scale. And we don't know where early farming lies in that spectrum.
No.
There are many unanswered questions about to what extent people tilled, so, cultivated, ploughed the soil. And if they did, when did that begin? Whether they used fertilizers, manures. We know which crops they grew, but in what combinations, how were animals involved? I think these are fascinating questions that I would like to have the answer to one day. But I don't have them now.
But a mystery for now.
We can also say that, there's been a lot of sort of projecting back our modern ideas of what farming life would have been like, right? And it's just sort of been colored by the idea of the medieval peasant farmer, right?
Yeah.
Where we always imagine, in the medieval era, you had these peasants and their life was really hard and they worked a lot. Historians are now actually saying, well, actually, probably farmers in medieval Europe didn't work as much as we do nowadays, right, in our normal jobs.
They had it easier, actually.
And this sort of had colored the debate also about this transition where, hunter-gatherers, they're sort of these kind of semi-hippies that only work 4 hours a day and do a bit of gathering, a bit of hunting, but their life's kind of easy. They're generally quite healthy. They have no violence. It's sort of the idea of the noble savage almost.
Yeah.
And then, farming starts and this is bad, right? I mean, Jared Diamond famously wrote in an article in the journal, I think it was Nature or Science, that, agriculture was the worst idea in human history.
Yeah, root of all evil.
Exactly.
Worst mistake in the history of the human race.
Yeah. And so basically that, because then, in farming we get locked in to this, toil in the fields and it causes the wars and the violence and health declines and so forth. And yeah, some of this is true, right? Because, we have larger numbers of people staying in the same place at the same time for longer and sort of crowding in, and they have to develop some sort of social mechanisms to deal with that. And that sort of coincides with a period where we see these kind of communal buildings emerging in the Neolithic of Southwest Asia that are, the best known examples are Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe in southeastern Turkey, where you have these monumental structures, right? But yeah, this entire debate has been sort of, we're wearing our modern glasses looking at the past, but we don't, as Joe said, we don't really have a really in-depth understanding of what their lives day to day were necessarily like.
And we also have this idea, as you mentioned, that the development of farming improved everyone's life significantly. And it definitely changed the way we live, we can say that for sure. But when people shifted from foraging to farming, did their lives actually improve, or did agriculture create as many challenges as it solved?
Yeah, so as Toby already alluded to, it was definitely a mixed bag, and it wasn't that people adopted it because it was an improvement overall. So on the negative side, it seems to have decreased their overall health due to restricting the range of their diet, so they were getting a less nutritious diet overall, although perhaps that could have been overstated in some cases. Also seems to have increased their susceptibility to diseases through close contact with animals, and a lot of diseases then jump from animals to humans. Also, they're living in higher population densities, and that makes disease more likely to spread. On the positive side, they're able to sustain larger population densities, which gives you the possibility to do things like build impressive monuments, to invest more time in things that are not producing or gathering food.
Yeah.
It also gave people more predictability in their food supply. They were in a way controlling the life cycles of the plants and the animals. And it also, and we can see that this was probably a big emphasis of the early farmers, that they seemed to like to produce food that could be stored. So grains that could be stored, beans that could be dried and stored, for example.
Yeah.
And this probably gave them a kind of insurance mechanism against wild foods failing. But we should also really remember that, again, this was a slow process. It wasn't an overnight shift. For the first several thousand years even, the first farmers were also foragers. So in a way, they were getting the best of both worlds.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until much later that hunting and gathering lifestyle slowly died out. And maybe that's the point where you can say that, so this was maybe 8,000 to 6,000 years ago, then people maybe started to really suffer from an exclusive dependence on farming. But it's sort of a different question as to why that shift happened.
But while it was both, it was actually maybe a more balanced lifestyle when you had both farming and foraging side by side.
Yeah, I would think you get the best of both worlds, basically.
Yeah.
Depending on how much you emphasize one or the other.
Tobias, your research as part of the Shubeika archaeological project found evidence for bread making thousands of years before agriculture in the traditional sense emerged. And this is pretty crazy when you think about it. What can this discovery tell us about the relationship between food, technology, and then the eventual adoption of farming?
Yeah, so this was a discovery we made at a site called Shebeka 1, which is in northeastern Jordan. And that is a site that dates to a period we call the late Epipaleolithic in the Levant. So it's dated to about between 14,000 and 12,000 or so years old. And this is a hunter-gatherer site. So these are people that are still living as gatherer-hunters, although at that point they're starting to maybe become a little bit more sedentary than they did in previous periods. So they're staying in the same places for longer. And Shebeka 1 is blessed with a really fantastic preservation of botanical remains, which, usually come to us because they've been burnt and then they're preserved in the sediments, and we have to take a lot of samples and float these samples in a flotation tank to extract them. And curiously, in that particular period, that material is unfortunately not always well preserved at all sites. So we've been very, very lucky there. And when our archaeobotanist, Amaya Arranz-Otayego, who's now at the University of the Basque Country, looked through these samples in the lab, she noticed these weird kind of microscopic little lumps of pieces. So you look through the microscope and you're trying to sort them into different categories, right? Okay, here's your seeds and here's your charcoal and here's all this other stuff, right? And then she was consulting with some colleagues and they started to realize that actually this other stuff that most archaeobotanists had always sort of put on the side are actually these bits of food remains that had somehow ended up in the fire at the site, right?
Yeah.
So people are sitting around their campfire and they're eating food and chatting and they're throwing things away in the fire to burn it off. And so at this period, people seem to be, of course, gathering a lot of different plants. And of course, they're also hunting and so forth, but they haven't started to cultivate any of the plants yet, as far as we know. And what Amaya found was that these little bits of food remains were some kind of proto-bread or dough that's been made. So it's not the kind of bread we find in a Danish bakery. There's no rugbrød and so forth.
It's not a sourdough loaf.
It's not a sourdough loaf yet. It's very simple, sort of flat bread, maybe a bit like the pita bread we find in the Middle East nowadays. And it was made using both flour from cereal grasses, as we make bread today, but also sometimes they're using other ingredients from these plants called Bulboschoenes glaucus, which are sedges or reeds that grow at the edge of water, usually on the shoreline of lakes or on small wadis and rivers and so forth. And they're using the nutlets, the root tubers that are in the ground, and they're grinding these up and are mixing them in. We're not quite sure why. They're quite nutritious, but it could have also been kind of an emergency food that they added to some of these, at least.
Links a bit back to what I said about storage, right? That this was a way of maybe processing foods into something that could be stored.
Bread packs a lot of calories, right? You're basically taking all of the labor that you did grinding the flour and so forth, and you're packing it together in a really dense kind of package. That's why we shouldn't eat too much bread, right? And it produces glucose because it's got carbohydrates, so that makes it very tasty and nutritious and so forth. And as Joe said, you can store it, right? So you can carry it around quite easily and you can store it. And this is remarkable because we always thought that bread comes after the beginning of cultivation and agriculture, right? It was always like, well, first they're cultivating the cereals and then they're making the products. But we can actually see that the products precede the production or the mass production of the ingredients, right?
Yeah.
So this opens up an interesting perspective in that if the products preceded the mass production of the ingredients, then this may imply a link of causality or a chain of causality that the product fostered, or the demand for the product fostered the production of the ingredients on a larger scale, right?
Yeah.
So maybe the beginning of agriculture, as we understand it, wasn't about climate change or about population pressure, but simply because people wanted to have delicious bread and have more of it.
And then had to figure out how to make it on a larger scale.
Exactly, yeah.
Have you tried it? I have. I would not call it delicious.
That's true. We did produce it at some point experimentally, and maybe we're just not as good bakers
Probably,
as the people in the Epipaleolithic.
Maybe your
were.
technique is lacking.
Because you grind the flour on a grinding stone, and so it's full of these little fragments of basalt that catch in your teeth.
And that's actually something we see archaeologically. We see that in this period, the hunter-gatherers had these really worn-down teeth.
Okay, from eating all that hard
stone.
bread.
because they're eating stuff that's been ground on these ground stone artifacts with lots of basalt flakes in it. Yeah.
That's a really interesting connection to make with those things.
I mean, there are competing ideas. One other idea is that they were already starting to make some beer in this period in the late Epipaleolithic, right? So there's a site in Israel called Rakafet Cave where they've argued that they found this evidence for beer making in the same period. So they were a bit competing. Was it bread or was it beer? Was it bread or beer? Or maybe it was both.
Yeah, bread and beer combo.
Yeah, and because they're very closely related, right? They both involve the similar ingredients. They both involve some form of fermentation. So you can see that they're probably friends somehow. But irrespective of whether it was bread or beer, it's a fascinating idea to put food and foodways before agriculture, and thinking that this could be actually the driver behind why people are deciding to cultivate plants and so forth on a large scale.
Yeah, looking at that process in a reverse way, right? Joe, you use machine learning and large data sets in your archaeological research. So how does this modern version of archaeology look, in comparison to the classical perception of people sitting in a dish with a small brush?
Yeah, well, it's definitely an addition to the conventional view rather than something replaces it. So, as you mentioned, machine learning, you only really get anything out of it if you have a large data set, quite a lot of data really. You have to make machine learning be worth it. In archaeology, we don't get that data without somebody sitting with a brush, basically. So we have to keep doing that, and we have to keep compiling these data sets, which is the most time-consuming and hardest part of doing this kind of research. But the reason that I like to do it is because I think you do accumulate all this knowledge that archaeologists have generated over a century of excavating in the Middle East. There are so many insights you can get into like really large-scale, long time-scale processes of sort of human adaptation, cultural evolution, how we have changed environments and how they've sort of shaped our societies in return. These are things that only archaeology can give you. The historical record is not long enough to do that. Other disciplines don't give us this long 10,000 year and longer story to work with. And that's why I really like to use the larger data sets and machine learning, other statistical tools that really make the most out of them.
Makes archaeology very hip and technologically cool.
Yeah, keeping up with the times.
I mean, to be fair, archaeologists have also been very early adopters of computers. First computer applications of archaeology were in the 1950s.
Oh, really?
So we beat a lot of other disciplines to that.
Yeah, so we were actually cool from the beginning.
Yes, that's right.
We liked statistics before it was cool.
Yeah, yeah.
Or maybe we've always been nerds.
You both study how people adapted to these major environmental changes in the past. Are there any lessons or maybe even warnings that modern societies should take from these very first farming communities?
Yeah, so if we look at this transition from the Pleistocene to the Holocene, this happened around 12,000 years ago. It seems to have played some role in triggering the origin of agriculture around the world and in the Middle East specifically, even though we don't know exactly how that worked. But this was the sort of most dramatic climate transition that our species has had to deal with in its modern history. And people did adapt to it. It wasn't a disaster. But I think we can say that this climate transition, this warming of about 2 degrees, I think, over a period of a few thousand years, this was a very dramatic shift for humanity. It really changed our lives more than any other moment in our evolution. And we are still living with the consequences today. So it was a permanent shift we had to go through. And then the warning, the scary thing, is that compared to that, the biggest, most momentous climate change we've been through, the climate change we are now experiencing is of a whole nother level. As a greater magnitude, is happening much, much, much faster. So, in real terms, we can see in archaeology that our ancestors had to adapt to a couple of degrees of warming over a few thousand years, and they found that difficult and disruptive. And we have to adapt to the same amount of warming or more in 100 years.
It's also, I think, just to add to that, often this transition to agriculture has been seen as a sort of event where we became locked in.
Yeah.
And if we look at today, 99% of the world's population basically completely rely on agriculture. If we all had to go out and do farming tomorrow, all of us, we would be, there would not be enough land. We wouldn't have the knowledge and so forth. And so there's a lesson there also about unintended consequences, right?
Yeah.
At some point, 15, 14, 12,000 years ago, some guys in Western Asia basically somehow ended up cultivating plants, right? And it just led to the next thing and the next
trapping
thing.
humanity with that.
Exactly. And now we're in this situation where we have a very high world population, right? We're very reliant on actually a decreasing number of people that actually grow the food. There are a lot of challenges concerning the biodiversity, of the environment surrounding the fields. There is a concern over the genetic variability of the different crop species that we have, about animal agriculture, right, which uses a lot of land and produces a lot of greenhouse gas emissions and so forth. So there are also lessons concerning our own sustainability practices for the future in thinking about the very long-term agricultural development back into prehistory, really, and thinking thinking about these sort of unintended consequences of what we're doing now, what could all of that lead to in
12,000 years from now?
12,000 years, exactly, yeah.
You remind me that another important thing to think about is that when our ancestors experienced this Pleistocene-Holocene transition, they were surrounded by rich, resilient, diverse ecosystems, wild ecosystems. And that was a huge part in buffering, this transition. It wasn't the humans that were doing it. The ecosystems responded to climate change, and then humans were able to adapt to those changes in ecosystems. Now we don't have that, because we've destroyed the wild ecosystems in large part. So we are experiencing, again, a more dramatic change without the cushion. We're living in a very fragile, weak, domesticated ecosystem.
Without that buffer.
Yeah. If we think about the crops that people rely on today, there are a few crops from the Middle East. So, wheat, actually, mainly wheat, and then maize, which comes from Central America, and rice, which comes from East Asia. These three crops together are responsible for something like 80-90% of the calories that all people in the world eat today. And these are plants that had evolved in particular conditions. Wheat evolved in the deserts of the Middle East. It's adapted to a certain range of temperature and rainfall. And humans have, over many thousands of years, been able to push that out. So now we have wheat growing up here in Denmark.
Yeah.
But fundamentally, the plant is still, restricted to the environments that it evolved for. You can't push it too far out. And based on the models we have at the moment, in a few centuries, then very large parts of the world are going to be knocked out of what's called the climate envelope in which rice, wheat, and maize can grow. So we're going to have large parts of the world that are now growing these crops that can't grow them in the future. Right. And that's going to create major problems, because we can't just magic into existence new crops that are adapted to these new conditions. We have to work with what our ancestors started to create for us 10,000 years ago.
What would the result of something like that? This is not on my question list, but now I'm curious. What would that scenario then end up as if the crops that can't grow in those areas, what will happen? Will they have to resort to native crops for those areas, or will they just be without food?
I guess, one solution is always technological, right? So you can always try to find some technological solutions to these problems with irrigation and so forth, but that might just make other problems worse. But we're actually, both Joe and I, involved in this Ancient Environmental Genomics Initiative for Sustainability Project, or AEGIS. And in AEGIS, we try to use sedimentary DNA, so DNA or genetic information taken out of sediments from archaeological sites and places close to archaeological sites, to try and reconstruct this ancient genetic diversity of different crop species, to see how did they adapt to climate change and humans messing around with them over thousands of years. And are there some genetic traits that we've lost through the process of plant domestication that we could use to basically create more climate resilient crops that can adapt to these climate changes that Joe has described that are coming to us?
Okay, cool. So genetically modify new crops.
Like a Jurassic Park for crops, basically.
For wheat.
I think they don't necessarily have to be genetically modified. They could also be bred to reproduce the same traits. But yes, essentially the idea is to take some of this lost diversity from the past and hopefully help to address these problems.
So there's hope, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, definitely.
Okay, in a few decades we'll be eating a new type of bread.
Yeah. The Chewbacca bread.
Yeah, Chewbacca bread version. All right, looking forward to it.
As you say, we might be finding new lost native crops or wild plants even. Domesticating them just like our ancestors did.
Make actual Danish sourdough or something that actually grows here. Well, we're getting close to the end of this episode, but I have one more big question, which is, what is the biggest misconception that the public, or maybe even other archaeologists and colleagues, still hold about the origins of agriculture and early farming communities?
Oh God, so many. Well, the past was always more complex and colorful, I think, than we often give it credit for. When it comes to the transition to agriculture, it still has this association with the idea that this is the origins of civilization, right? As we discussed earlier in the episode, that there was somehow a linear evolution from hunter-gatherers to farmers to chiefdoms to states and then classical civilization and then onwards. But the past was definitely much more complicated and not as linear, I think. And I think there's also it goes back to this debate over whether agriculture was a bad idea or whether it was the cause of all good things that happened to humanity, right? I think we've got to take that with a grain of salt. I always discuss with my students at the university here what caused the French Revolution, right? I mean, if you talk to different historians, they'll give you a different answer, right? And we can also then say, well, was the French Revolution good or bad? Sure, it was good on some level, but it also led to, a lot of people dying under the guillotine, basically.
Yeah. Double-edged sword.
Exactly, right. So that's definitely one misconception that still exists. And I think for the public, it's also still this idea that, I mean, we saw this in the recent remarks from the current president of the United States that he'll bomb Iran back into the Stone Age, right? I mean, this is just exemplifies the idea that in the Stone Age, everything was primitive and backwards and not advanced or in any kind of way. It was different, but these people were obviously highly intelligent. They were just as capable as we are today, but they had a very different outlook on life.
I would say, in terms of my colleagues, other archaeologists, I think there's often a misconception that this is a very well studied or well understood period.
Yeah.
I think it has this reputation that because it's been studied for 100 years, it's seen as a sort of chapter in human history that is relevant for the global story where farming began and then spread around the world, that people think, we know everything about it. But I think as this conversation reveals, we really don't. There are really basic questions about, what did a Neolithic farmer get up and do in the morning that we don't know. And it's not there are not many people studying it. We made a lot of progress. We have a lot of evidence, but there's certainly a lot of open questions. And this would be my key takeaway also for the conversation, would be that there's plenty more to do in this area.
There's still some blanks to be filled in.
Many, many blanks.
Yeah. All right. That actually leads us to the very end of this episode. And I just would like if each of you can share one thing that you'd like our listeners to take with them as sort of a key takeaway, as you said already, Joe, but something that they should take with them after hearing our conversation today.
Be very grateful for the products of agriculture that you can rely on every single day, and be grateful to the people in the Middle East 10,000 years ago that actually, created the basis on which you can have wholebrød or sourdough for lunch or breakfast or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Our ancestors gave us a gift there, and we need to make the most of it.
All right. Great. That wraps up this episode. Tobias and Joe, thank you both so much for coming on the show. It's been absolutely great having you in the studio today.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thanks.
And thank you, dear listener, for tuning in to this episode of Let's Dig Deeper. I hope you've learned lots and that you're going to try and see if you might have green thumbs like the early farmers. If you have any questions or suggestions for the podcast, you can reach us at letsdigdeeperpodcast@gmail.com. Again, that is letsdigdeeperpodcast@gmail.com. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so that you never miss an episode. And please rate us 5 stars so that we can reach more people. You can find us on social media under the name Let's Dig Deeper. I'm Zinat Haroun, and I've been your host. You can reach me on Instagram at @z_archaeology. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you next time, where we will dig deeper into another topic. Bye!